Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and today we're going to do a review and comparison of the Nikon 200-500 and the Nikon 300PF. Now before we begin, I want to mention that you can see the images from this video on the companion blog post at my site. The link will be here in the video and in the description area over on YouTube. Now I get questions nearly every day on one or both of these lenses, usually asking which is the better choice for wildlife photography. I've been using the 300PF for quite a while now and was just recently able to put my third copy of the 200-500 through its paces. No, don't rewind the video, you heard that right. I had to get 3 different copies of the 200-500 before I found one that was sharp. The first 2 were not even close. My initial thought was that I was just unlucky, but then I read another review for the 200-500 and they ended up with a couple of poor copies as well. So if you do decide to go the 200-500 route, make sure you test the lens thoroughly during the return period. So anyway, which lens is the right choice for you? Well, it really depends on what you're using the lens for. I'll give some recommendations at the end of the video, but for now, let's go ahead and compare and review these two lenses. Size. The first aspect is size. Now, normally I don't linger too long on this because, you could just look at the lenses and you can see the difference, right? Well, here's the thing. There is a huge difference between these two in both bulk and weight, and for some shooters, this may be a critical consideration. One of the biggest advantages to the 300PF is the size. It's about the same size as a 24-70 and weighs even less. This is thanks to the phased Fresnel lens technology used to reduce the weight and size of the optic. The downside is that this Fresnel lens element can cause some odd halos and flares around highlights, but from a practical field perspective, I just haven't seen it happen, and it's been a non-issue for me thus far. On the other hand, the convenience of this lens's compact size just cannot be overstated. The 300PF is always my first choice when hiking or anytime I need to go light. Heck, it even stands upright in my backpack instead of on its side like my other telephoto lenses, leaving more space for other gear. Beyond that, however, it's so much easier to use in tight quarters or when you need to pick your way through brush and trees and such. Nothing more annoying than trying to maneuver yourself and a large lens through a thicket when you're trying to stay quiet and stalk an animal. This lens just makes you so much more nimble than a typical telephoto. Plus, the lens is amazingly hand-holdable. On the other hand, the 200-500 isn't terribly huge, at least not compared to my 600 f4 and some of the other large glass I've used in the past. I'd categorize it as a mid-sized telephoto. The 200-500 could certainly be handheld when needed, and I did quite a bit of that while testing it. However, I did find myself putting it on a tripod for longer shoots or when the light was lower, much more so than I would have with the 300PF. Build quality. Now, I almost hate to talk about build quality since it's so subjective, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. While not at the level of some of the big primes, both of these lenses seem to have excellent build quality and neither feels cheap or, to use the technical term, plasticky. The 300PF feels like it's built to the same standards as optics like the 24-70 or the 70-200. Very solid, and the focusing ring feels great. No complaints at all. The 200-500 is maybe just a very small notch below that, but not enough to worry about. The zoom is very smooth, as is the AF ring. I have heard complaints about the hood on the 200-500 falling off, and I was unsure about those claims until my hood fell off when I was going through some brush. It doesn't really lock in very well, so definitely exercise caution so you don't inadvertently knock it off while you shoot. I've even heard of some photographers using gaffer's tape to help keep it in place. The lens collar on the 200-500 is just okay in my opinion. I've seen worse Nikon collars, but I've also seen better. Rotation is more or less smooth if you get the tension just right, so you can definitely use it on a gimbal head. However, since I'm always looking for an upgrade, I purchased the Kirk replacement collar and gave that a try. It's an upgrade in every respect, but not a major upgrade overall, if that makes sense. Everything about the Kirk collar is better, just not worlds better than the stock unit. Still, I like the longer integrated Arca Swiss mount, the better knob, the better build quality, and the better overall stability, so I'm going to go ahead and keep it. Speaking of collars, the 300PF does not come with a collar, mostly because it doesn't need one. People are accustomed to putting a collar on a telephoto lens, but keep in mind this lens weighs less than both the 24-70 and the 14-24, and no one worries about putting collars on those lenses. The only other nit I have with the 200-500 would be the zoom ring itself. A normally jointed human simply cannot twist that thing from 200 to 500 with one smooth motion. Speaking of which, I've heard of people just grabbing the front and using it like a push-pull lens. That reminds me of some of my first jobs, which were in camera stores where we'd see repairs, and I feel like that's exactly the kind of behavior that might land your lens in the shop, so I'd go ahead and zoom the way Nikon intended. Finally, both lenses have the little rubber weatherproofing gasket around the lens mount, and from what I can tell from Nikon, it seems like they have some degree of resistance to water and dust infiltration, but not at the level of the more expensive super telephoto glass. Also keep in mind that Nikon is always quick to remind folks that if you soak the lens and it breaks, it's not their problem. Vibration reduction. First off, I have to say I don't have any foolproof way to test VR for you. However, I do have some info based on a few tests and some field observation for these two lenses. So we'll start with the fact that Nikon claims 4.5 stops worth of VR goodness for both lenses, so at least in theory, they should be the same. That said, I actually think the 200-500 has better VR performance than the 300PF does. Again, all I can tell you is how these two lenses seem to perform, and it just seems like I get more VR satisfaction with the 200-500 over the 300PF. In fact, the main reason the 200-500 sees a tripod more than the other one is that I just get sick of holding it sometimes. I think that with VR, the 200-500 is generally very hand-holdable for most people if you want to go that way. Now for the 300PF. I know that early copies of the 300PF had some issues with VR at speeds between 1/60th and 1/200th of a second or so. Nikon has since claimed a fix for this, however, not so sure. The 300PF is a bit of an odd duck when it comes to VR. The VR seems to perform differently on some camera configurations than others, and there's been boatloads of talk about this on the internet. The general consensus seems to be the VR system sometimes creates some sort of resonance between the lens and the body, causing blur at the previously mentioned speeds. In my own observations, I've seen this as well. On my D5, the VR on the 300PF seems equal to the 200-500. However, I can't say the same when it's on my gripped D500 and the shutter speeds are between 1/60th and 1/200th of a second. With the grip attached to the D500, I'm simply not able to get tack sharp images in that shutter speed range. In fact, my hit rate is actually a little bit higher with the VR turned off. However, when I remove the grip, things do get better, although the VR still doesn't perform at the same level as the 200-500. My gripped D7200 seems to do okay as well, not as good as the D5, but better than the gripped D500. Of course, this could just be my lens, but there are more than a few continuing reports about this on the internet. Thankfully, most of my shooting with a 300PF tends to be at 1/250th of a second or faster, so this odd little VR issue doesn't really seem to affect me too much. However, it can be frustrating if you're relying on VR to help out with slower shutter speeds, so in my opinion, this is a definite issue that should be considered with this lens. If nothing else, if you do purchase this lens, make sure you test yours once the UPS man drops it off. As for VR modes, they both feature normal and sport modes. Think of normal mode as a general purpose VR mode, like when you have a more or less stationary subject. Sport mode, on the other hand, is designed to be used when you're tracking action and such. My understanding is that while normal mode may slow down your AF and frame rate, sport mode will not, although the VR in sport mode may not be quite as effective. Honestly, I've played with both modes, and in practice, I don't really see too much difference. However, my experimentation with this has been admittedly limited, and I do tend to use the modes as Nikon describes. Versatility. Which lens is the most versatile is actually a little tricky. The 300PF is incredibly versatile in its own way. Its compact size makes it super easy to pack and carry when a larger lens would be a hassle. Plus, it takes a teleconverter really well, turning it into a 420mm f5.6. There's just not a more compact option that can equal it. However, when it comes to versatility, you really can't beat a zoom. The 200-500 has an ideal range for most wildlife photographers, and it's the lens I've been keeping next to me in the seat of my truck when I'm driving through target-rich wildlife areas. In practice, I found the zoom exceedingly valuable when photographing animals at varying distances, and frankly, can chalk up quite a few shots that I would have missed had I been stuck at a single focal length. The ability to zoom adds a really valuable tool to your arsenal and should not be underestimated. And although the 300PF can also take a teleconverter, I can promise you that you can zoom much faster than fiddling with the extender. In the end, for versatility, I have to give it to the 200-500 all the way. Maximum aperture. Okay, I know this is obvious. The 300PF is an f4, the 200-500 is a 5.6. The winner is clearly the 300PF. However, I think far too many people are too quick to dismiss this one-stop difference. There are several major benefits with using f4 over f5.6. Now, the first is obvious. You get one more stop of light. Again, many folks dismiss this, but how much do you think Nikon would charge if they just came up with a new camera that was one full stop better than anything else on the market right now? Heck, just look at the difference in price between the 300 f4 and the 300 2.8 to see how much one stop can be worth to the right person. This point was really driven home to me when I was sorting out my photos from the last trip that were taken with the 200 to 500. I'm accustomed to shooting f4 lenses, and all it took was a few minutes looking at all that extra noise from the 200 to 500's f5.6 to really appreciate those f4 optics. However, it goes beyond that too. An f4 lens is going to give you a brighter viewfinder, which may not seem like a big deal, but it's certainly something I noticed and welcomed every time I switched from the 200 to 500 to the 300 PF. An f4 lens is also going to give you cleaner backgrounds than an f5.6 will. Busy backgrounds can be the death of a good photo, so even if I don't need the extra speed, I'll take f4 any day over f5.6. After all, when it comes to wildlife, the cleaner the background, the happier you'll be. That said, I have to say that the 200 to 500 has some of the best background rendering of any f5.6 lens I've ever seen. It may still be a little busy for my taste in some circumstances, but at least it's not a totally unpleasant look. But there's even more. Another aspect that's seldom considered is AF performance. The smaller that maximum opening gets, the less effective your AF sensors can become. For instance, even in the D5 and D500, many of the cross-type AF sensors will revert to regular line sensors when coupled with a lens that's f5.6 or slower. This decreases both the lens's ability to lock onto a subject and its ability to stay locked on. So, generally speaking, the faster the lens, the better the AF performance will be. Of course, if you add a teleconverter to the 300 PF, you turn it into a 420mm f5.6, and it instantly levels the playing field between the two optics. Teleconverters. Both lenses could take a teleconverter really well. However, the 300 PF does seem to take my 1.4 TC a little better than the 200 to 500 does. Obviously, the 300 f4 becomes a 420 f5.6, so it does slow things down a bit, but not too much. In short, while I still try to avoid using teleconverters whenever I can, I will use one on my 300 PF when needed and without hesitation. I did try my 1.4 TC3 on the 200 to 500, and it does work and can produce very sharp results. However, the AF isn't as reliable, and it does slow things down a bit. That said, and the truth is, f8 is just too slow for my taste. I personally would not want to use a teleconverter on this lens unless absolutely necessary. AF performance. First, let's talk speed. We'll start with the 200 to 500. The first time I used this lens, I thought the AF was the automotive equivalent of a little old lady driving slowly down the highway with her left blinker on. It'll get you there just fine, but it's not in a hurry. On the other hand, the 300 PF is very respectable, and while slightly slower than some of my other glass, it's still more than acceptable. Attach a teleconverter, and it still seems a touch faster than the 200 to 500 without one. To demonstrate this, I used my iPhone to show you the relative AF speeds. The lenses are both set to 2.2 meters and then focus to nearly infinity. Here's the 200 to 500. Now here's the 300 PF. Now the 200 to 500 again. Now the 300 PF with a teleconverter. No matter how you slice it, the 300 PF just has snappier AF. Now, even though the 200 to 500 is a little sluggish in the AF department, it really is generally adequate and can get the job done. The slower AF can be a problem for closer subjects, since at close range the lens needs to move the focusing ring quite a bit in a very short amount of time, and I can attribute some of my missed shots to this. In many cases, when I had a close subject rapidly moving towards me, my typical hit rate with this lens seemed lower than my faster focusing optics. However, at a normal distance, when the lens didn't need to move the focusing ring very much between shots, my hit rate was better, although still not quite up to my faster f4 optics. I actually think this is a combination of slower AF speed coupled with the slower f5.6 maximum aperture sapping away some of the AF sensor's sensitivity. However, don't get the wrong idea, this lens is certainly adequate for tracking birds in flight, and you'll get plenty of keepers. My seat of the pants estimate was that I missed about 15 to 20% more action shots with the 200 to 500 than I do with my f4 optics like the 300 PF. That aside, the biggest problem with the slower AF really isn't the ability to track, it's the ability to initially acquire and or reacquire focus. With the 300pf, I can point at a bird flying by and it's in focus so quickly that I barely even notice. However, the 200 to 500 and to a lesser extent the 300pf with a teleconverter attached will make you wait a bit longer, sometimes causing you to miss the shot before you can really lock on. The other issue is reacquisition. When I lost my lock on my flying subjects with the 200 to 500 and again to a lesser extent with the 300pf and the teleconverter, it was a bit more difficult to reacquire that lock than it is with the faster 300pf. Now, all that said, keep in mind I'm talking about birds in flight. For slower or stationary subjects, this is a non-issue, and the AF speed with the 200 to 500 or the 300pf and teleconverter is absolutely fine. Also, note that both lenses have a focus limiter. When shooting subjects at a normal distance, I turn this on so the lens doesn't have to cycle all the way through the entire range when it's trying to get a lock. It did make a difference, especially on the 200 to 500, and I recommend you limit the AF on that lens. Just don't forget you turned it on if a closer subject pops up. Finally, one thing I really like about both of these lenses is that they have really close minimum focus distances. This is a huge advantage for photographing smaller subjects, and in my opinion, something special that the big exotic primes sometimes can't compete with. Sharpness. Okay, you probably noticed there was a wardrobe change here. The reason for that was as I was putting this video together, I thought of a few more points I wanted to make in this section, so I ended up just reshooting it. First off, I want to say that both lenses are very sharp and I use them both without any reservations. They're both capable of delivering tack-sharp results even wide open, and so far I don't really feel any need to stop them down to improve sharpness. Now, let's look at some details. I did a number of sharpness tests between the two lenses, and what I saw from actual shooting corroborated the results I saw in the tests. The first test I did was an indoor setup for a very controlled test of sharpness. So we'll start with the 300pf and then the 200 to 500 set to 300mm. As you can see in this comparison, both lenses perform really well, but unsurprisingly, the prime does have an edge. Next, I added a teleconverter to the prime and set the zoom to 420mm. Once again, the results are very close, although this time the zoom seems to be a touch sharper than the prime with the teleconverter. In my opinion, both lenses are close enough in sharpness that under most conditions, it really doesn't make too much difference, and I'm happy with the level of sharpness I see across the board. Next, we have some tougher outdoor tests. I wanted to do these to verify what I had been seeing in the field. These tests were deliberately shot at midday at a greater distance over my sunny lawn. The reason for this is that there's a bit of heat distortion in this scenario, and I wanted to see how each lens handled a less than ideal situation. I did this test on 2 different days to double check and verify my results. Also, for each lens, I shot a series of 5 images from a tripod, mirror up, refocusing by a live view between each image. Now, I know that some will argue that this isn't a fair test since I was deliberately shooting under poor conditions. However, the last time I checked, the outdoors wasn't always ideal. As wildlife and telephoto shooters, we have to sometimes deal with less than ideal conditions, and I think it's important to see what our lenses can do under those circumstances. So let's take a look at the 300mm results. In this first image, you can see the 300pf looks pretty good, and in fact, pretty much all the images from the 300pf in this series were around this level of sharpness. However, the 200 to 500 didn't fare as well. Out of 5 different shots, this was actually the sharpest. On the second attempt a few days later, there wasn't quite as much heat distortion present, and the two lenses are much closer in sharpness, as you can see here, with the 300pf still keeping an edge over the zoom. Now let's look at 420mm. In this first test, you can see the 200 to 500 and 300pf with teleconverter look pretty darn close. In fact, I don't see a significant difference between the two. In the second test image, you can see that the 300 with teleconverter actually looks just a touch better. However, I discovered the biggest takeaway isn't what you see here in the side-by-side images, it's the consistency of each optic. When trying to pick the sharpest image from each set of 5 images, I noticed it was always harder to pick the ones from the 300pf. The images were generally very close in sharpness, with only 1 or 2 being maybe slightly less sharp. On the other hand, it was a bit easier to pick the sharp one with the 200 to 500 since a larger percentage of those images were actually soft. In fact, I think that's what happened in the first test. I never actually captured a sharp image with a zoom due to the heat distortion. Had I shot another 5 frames, I may have captured one that was closer to the prime. However, in the real world, we don't always have the opportunity to shoot a ton of shots in order to get one sharp one, so I think this is a definite advantage for the 300mm. The 200-500 just doesn't seem to cut through heat-induced atmospheric distortion as well as the 300, but of course, no lens is perfect in that scenario. With the teleconverter attached, the consistency of the 300PF was closer to the performance of the 200-500, but still had a slightly higher number of relatively sharp images compared to the zoom. Now, I really want to stress that under normal conditions, both lenses perform very well, and I find the consistency of the 200-500 to be just as good as the 300PF in the vast majority of situations. I just thought it was interesting that when faced with heat or atmospheric distortion, the 300PF seems to do a bit better. Again, from a sharpness standpoint, under normal conditions in the real world, the two lenses actually are really close. Also, remember you can view these sample images on the companion page at my site. I'll put a link here in the video, or you can get it from the video description over on YouTube. Recommendations. After shooting with both of these lenses, it's hard to say which one is the best choice, and I encourage you to consider the points in this review and choose the optic that seems best suited to your particular needs. Also, note that I am impressed enough with both lenses that I'm not planning on selling either one. That said, I'm going to go ahead and give you some of my thoughts on the subject. First, if you're a full-frame shooter doing wildlife, it's not even a contest, go for the 200-500. Well, I love the 300PF, it's just not long enough on a full-frame camera for most wildlife use, so it would be married to a teleconverter all the time. For crop body shooters, it's a little tougher choice. I use my 300PF all the time on my D500 without a teleconverter, and it's faster and sharper than the 200-500 at 300mm. Plus, it does take the 1.4 teleconverter pretty well, giving you an ultra-compact, lightweight 420mm lens. It's my first choice for hiking through the woods and has worked out amazingly well for me when I want a hand-holdable, lightweight setup during 4-mile-plus hikes. Interestingly, the smaller optic seems less intimidating to wildlife, and I find I can generally get a bit closer with it than with my larger glass. Still, although I love the little 300PF, I have to say that after using both lenses, I really think that for the majority of wildlife shooters who just want a single lens, the 200-500 is probably the way to go. Its extreme versatility and added focal length really make it a slightly better choice for most people. Additionally, the 200-500 is an incredible bargain, and that really needs to be taken into consideration as well. Right now, it's $600 cheaper than the 300PF, and you don't need a $500 teleconverter to get to 420mm and beyond. That said, keep in mind that while it's an impressive lens, it's also not about to replace the big f4 and 2.8 primes. I mention this because I have seen the discussion come up from time to time with the thought that maybe this lens is just as good as, say, a 500mm f4. As someone who has shot a 500 f4 and now shoots a 600 f4, I can promise you that's not the case. The big primes are not only faster in both aperture and AF, but there's also a very real difference in rendering, contrast, and to use another technical term, pop. The 200-500 is really good, but you do have to be realistic with your expectations. The good news is that you probably can't go wrong either way. Both optics can definitely get the job done. However, there is more to getting the image on your memory card than just having the right lens. You also need the right technique, and that's where my ebook, Secrets to Studying Wildlife Photography, comes in. It's 290 pages that will teach you all of my very best tips, tricks, and techniques for putting award-winning images on your memory card. Check it out at my site and join the thousands of others who are already putting the advice to work each time they're out shooting. Also, make sure you stop by my site and sign up for my free email newsletter so you never miss a video or an article. And of course, I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.